Hello, welcome back to the Brendan O'Neill Show with me, Brendan O'Neill, and my special guest this week, Wilfred Reilly. Will, welcome to the show.
Great to be back on.
It's always good to have you on, especially because you've got this new book out, which I want to talk to you about. It's got one of those brilliant titles that American non-fiction books have. Your non-fiction book titles are far better than ours in Britain. It's called Lies My Liberal Teacher Told Me. And the subtitle is Debunking the False Narratives Defining America's School Curricula. And basically what you do, you run through 10 lies that are being fed to the new generation through the education system. It's very entertaining. I agree with some of the lies and the way you deconstruct them. And then others I was a bit more thrown by and had a few more questions about. So there's a couple of things I want to dig into in relation to the lies that you deconstruct. But I want to start off by asking you what compelled you to write the book, because it feels like a kind of contrarian hand grenade thrown into public discussion, which I mean as a compliment, by the way. But I just wondered what compelled you to look at what liberal teachers are teaching kids and to pick apart some of the things that they're saying.
The question there first, one of the reasons that I wrote kind of this lengthy contrarian book is that I think a lot of the things that we hear in mainstream, upper middle class discourse and pop culture, so on, are fringe nonsense. I don't think most people believe them. A classic example, which we both talked about in published articles, might be there are more than two sexes. And it's extremely bizarre to see a consensus form around them. Like the thing that made the US and UK wealthy was slavery. Oh, there are no physical differences between men and women. To say something like women are smaller, physically weaker, and perhaps slightly smarter than men would be extraordinarily controversial at a dinner party or something like that. And I think there's a weird disconnect between reality, which we can all see, and things that the expert and educational class and the media newsmen are often saying. And I was curious almost from an analytical perspective about why that was. So I think that that's what prompted me to write the book. And yeah, just very briefly, I mean, American publishers are in general fun. It's kind of like comparing British prime minister's questions to our press conferences where the president or his secretary just mumbles along for 30 minutes. I mean, the title of one of my books is Hate Crime Hoax, How the Left is Selling a Fake Race War. And I mean, definitely the goal is to move product in a very competitive market. I don't mind to have a great relationship with both publishers. But if you ever talk to something like a woman sci-fi writer and you ask, well, why is the hero, on all fours holding a sword on the cover? I mean, they'll tell you with some intensity, like they contract with a painter and then they put that out there and then they get the reviews from different presses and so on. At any rate, that's what prompted me to write the book itself. I think that in one sentence, because I have kind of a lengthy intro and I'll do something completely different and original here. But I mean, in one sentence, we're in a weird situation in the USA where after the switch over in wealth on average between the two parties, the people talking about resistance and how they're promoting the rebel narrative and this kind of thing are actually the people that are in charge of the country. Like the center left wing of the Democratic Party is what currently controls the White House. So that's 93% of the media. It's 80 or whatever percent of higher education. So I wanted to look at what the people that are actually in charge now are saying as a direct response to lies my teacher told me and a dozen other books that purport to do this, unpacking the sins of the conservative past, and see whether what these people are saying is accurate. And a lot of it's, like I said, complete nonsense. I'm talking about gender, talking about slavery, so on.
It's really interesting that you said that about consensus, because I want to ask you specifically, as we're having the conversation, about how consensuses are formed. I've always been fascinated by how this process works and how elite consensus opinion is forged in the modern era. I find it such an interesting process, and people end up believing the craziest things that most people out there don't actually believe. I want to ask you about that as we go along, but I want to jump into line number 4 in your book. I'm not going to go through all of them because people have to buy your book and read it. It's entertaining and it's full of interesting information. Line number 4 is hippies were the good guys. The sexual revolution was great for women and the Vietnam War was unpopular and pointless. Now, there's so much in there that would really antagonize a lot of people who think those things are all true. I've always had a bit of an issue with the hippies. I think their influence on Western culture and Western ideology was generally bad. So just explain to us a little bit about why you thought it was necessary to pick out the hippies and talk about their impact on the culture and why what we're told about them is not necessarily true.
So, one of the things that I've often thought, just doing independent research and also just honestly reading about the year the Knicks won the championship in our NBA or reading about sexuality following Woodstock, a lot of the movements to come out of the 60s were profoundly negative. In the USA, and I assume in most of the West, there's this kind of golden summer memory of the 1960s, early 1970s. I think bluntly because everyone was high and getting laid. Like these were pleasant times. If you were some dentist's daughter from Poughkeepsie who went to Woodstock and then partied for a couple of years and then settled down in the suburbs, which people still did at that point. But I mean, the overall impact of pretty much everything but early black civil rights or early feminism. I mean, and you can kind of list them, like the anti-nuke movement, which in my opinion has killed millions of people, was funded by the Russians from the beginning. The rest of the eco-freako stuff, black radicalism, like the Panthers, the new Panthers are still with us today in the USA. White radicalism, like the Weathermen, which directly inspired Black Bloc, which is still with us today. I mean, the drug revolution. I mean, a lot of people had fun with that in college and somebody can't describe it as a good thing empirically for society. The later part of the sexual revolution, where, I mean, public acceptance of kink and so on, some positive, but I mean, obviously a massive downside to that. Just on and on and on. If you look at what actually went on, the hardcore Altamont hippie movement, the Manson family, a lot of this crap was essentially just people saying the opposite of Chesterton's fence. Like we have these boring bourgeois rules. They exist for no reason and we should challenge them. And they're actually hilarious essays from the 1960s with names like Hair and Watch It that talk about what happens when people just abandon norms. Like what happens to intimate hygiene, or let's say when you just don't take baths for 2 weeks and you're living in a hippie squat. Like there are real downsides to this that actually many of us who were in the party scene for a period of time have encountered. So I talk about that, and I talk about how these movements started, the perception of hippies at the time, which was basically that they were doped up losers. So you go back to some of the famous pieces looking at the Berkeley scene and all that, talk about the Rainbow Family today. And I basically say, like, we need to be a little less nostalgic about these movements and a little more honest about what the social revolution did. You know, a great society, moving away from just people in the streets, but looking at this at the level of social policy, pay per child welfare, no fault divorce. Like, obviously, in the major sort of Five Eyes Western countries, we're dealing with this legacy today. Yeah, the chapters have, challenging, interesting titles and all that, but the point is pretty much accurate. And the Vietnam War, again, also not an ideally led war, but the point was to restrict the spread of communism. What happened in the Vietnam War was that the communist enemy we were warning about, the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese, took over South Vietnam, and Vietnam was operated as a fully communist country for about 30 years. So I don't see that the sort of center right got much of anything wrong about that conflict. Cambodia, the killing fields, also directly followed or pull out from Vietnam.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about this lie in particular, because it was one of my favorite chapters, I have to say. And it's interesting because I would have been against the Vietnam War. I'm generally quite an anti-imperialist person. I'm against foreign interventions overseas, interference in sovereign states, and so on, as are lots of people on the left and lots of people on the right as well. But I've always been intrigued by the way in which the Vietnam War is remembered, particularly in American culture. It seems to me there are two ways that it's remembered. Either it's the worst disaster that ever afflicted the United States, and every Vietnam War movie is just so depressing and horrible and soul-destroying, the collapse of humanity and everything else. That's what you get in the kind of Vietnam War films. And then you have the depiction of the anti-Vietnam War protesters of the 60s and 70s who tend to get an easy ride. They are depicted as the heroes of the moment, the great people. And what gets lost in all of that, and I've often found myself wondering about this, is the large numbers of Americans who did support this war, the large numbers of Americans who thought, well, we've got to stand up to communism, as you say, we've got to take a stand. So it's interesting the way in which people get airbrushed from history. How do you think that happens? On an issue like Vietnam, how does the narrative develop over the decades to bring us to a situation we're in today?
I think there are a lot of points that you brought up there. First of all, I think that the lunatic hostility to Vietnam is very similar to the hysteria we see about Israel and Palestine fighting today, really on both sides, although I'm very pro-Israel here. But when people show a body in a burnt car and say, can you imagine this? Can you imagine this horror? And I don't mean to be cruel or glib, but as a political scientist who studies war, yes, that's what happens if a missile, including one of ours from USA, flies off of line. I mean, it's very unfortunate. Hopefully families will be compensated, and hopefully there'll be some religion or something to comfort them. But that's what happens in battle. And I think a lot of people don't understand that. I'm sure, not having been a combat troop, I don't fully understand that. But Vietnam was the first war where a large number of actual battles were televised live. This had such a major impact on the population that's discussed in media studies and in ROTC that journalists during the later Gulf War were embittered. They weren't allowed to run around on the front lines taking pictures of corpses and servicemen's blown off hands and this kind of thing. So I think that that's why people decided the Vietnam War was a unique evil. I am absolutely positive that people would have opposed us fighting Nazi Germany had there been videos of like cute blonde kids shot in the head by Italian or American troops during the conquest of a first world country. I mean, that doesn't change the fact that World War II is a morally correct conflict for the US and the UK to fight it, to the extent morality exists at all, and definitely a logically correct conflict. So I think that's why there's such a negative backlash to Vietnam. The anti-Vietnam War protesters came out of the general Panther, Weatherman, SDS, so on Malou that I've been criticizing. Some of them were passionately against the war. You have to respect their ethics. But I mean, a lot of others just didn't want to get drafted. I mean, it's important to remember we had a military draft at this time. So this was one of the first large-scale campaigns for cowardice, in my opinion, in the West, where like full-scale 200-pound fighting men that played lacrosse for their college were showing up with their draft cards and ripping them up and saying, no, send other people instead, which was something that was actually verbatim said. Nothing is worth dying for, this type of crap. So I think that if you were around at that time and your own kind of spindly-legged son, as Mike Royko once put it, was tramping through a rice paddy overseas, you'd probably have absolutely no sympathy for these long-haired, Tarzan-looking college protesters. And you touched on that when you said, well, what were the actual public attitudes? The actual public attitudes toward Vietnam during the Vietnam War were very similar to those toward Gulf War II. I mean, by 1969, I believe is the year I use in the book, where I got polling data. I actually just went to Gallup. And I mean, it's pretty easy to find even online these days. But I mean, years into the war, well over half of Americans still supported the conflict. At the start of the war, the numbers, over 60%, were identical to what they were when we went into Iraq to take out Saddam Hussein. You know, the opposed position, and this is when we actually had boots on the ground. This is the advisors era. So this is years into the conflict. The opposed position was 23%. That's been kind of scrubbed from history. 2/3 of all servicemen in Vietnam, and service women as well, though mostly in auxiliary roles at that time, were volunteers. I mean, people wanted to go there. They wanted to beat the communists. They saw what was going on in South Vietnam, which included a great deal of atrocity. You know, the Viet Cong, it's important to realize, were an urban and rural insurgent movement that had very few limitations on what they could do, unlike the more organized North Vietnamese army. The idea that there are a lot of American atrocities in Vietnam takes the U.S. response to the conditions of combat completely out of context and just ignores reality, which is something I'm criticizing throughout this book. So I'm not primarily a Vietnam War scholar, but it struck me as just, again, in sort of a commonsensical way that most people would have wanted to win this war. We wouldn't have wanted to lose an ally as powerful as South Vietnam. Most people had a relative involved in the conflict. So I suspected there'd be very high levels of support. I looked and there were. In contrast, people hated hippies. I mean, the rate of public approval for quote-unquote hippies listed as hip youth. The rate of approval among working-class whites or blacks was 9%, 10%. It's, again, just a total reshaping of what people actually thought to fit the narrative of what they should have thought, mostly by the people that used to be hippies.
Hi, it's Brendan here. I just wanted to let you know about our next online event. On Wednesday, the 26th of June at 8 p.m, I'll be sitting down with Melanie Phillips, the brilliant broadcaster and Times columnist. Melanie and I will be live and in conversation via Zoom talking about why Israel must win the war against Hamas, the grim rise of anti-Semitism, and the crisis of the West. We'll also be taking questions from you, the audience. This is a free event exclusive to Spiked supporters, our online donor community. If you're already a Spike supporter, you can sign up for your ticket now on our online donor hub. And if you're not already a Spike supporter, now is the perfect time to become one. For as little as £5 a month, you can get your ticket to this event, plus you'll enjoy loads of other exclusive perks like ad-free reading, access to our comments section, and access to many more live events like this one. To become a Spike supporter, go to spiked-online.com/supporters. That's spiked-online.com/supporters. And I'll see you there on Wednesday, the 26th of June at 8 p.m. It's interesting you mentioned Israel, Gaza there. I'm also on the side of Israel. I think what was done to Israel on the 7th of October was a world historical crime. And Israel has the right to pursue the people who carried it out. But it's so interesting that if you look at the commentary about Israel-Gaza, coming from the left in particular, and those who oppose Israel, the Israelophobes, as some people refer to them, it is very much along the lines of, can you believe what we're seeing? And, there's this kaleidoscope of human suffering. Every time you open the internet, there is just image after image coming out of Gaza of broken bodies and dead children and so on. It's very much along the lines of you've just described in relation to the media effects, I guess, of the Vietnam War, which was, I suppose, the first war where people in America could see actual footage and photographs of what was happening. Same thing with Gaza. And I do sometimes want to say to these people, without sounding callous, of course, this happens in every war. There are broken bodies and dead children from the Iraq War, the Afghanistan War, even wars that people on the left may have been supportive of, revolutionary wars, for example, wars of national liberation. It happened in all of them. So to what extent do you think consensus these days on certain questions, whether it be Vietnam back in the 60s or Israel-Gaza today, is forged at an emotional level because people see images and they share images? So it's not even a kind of intellectual or rigorously thought through process, but it is that kind of instinctive response where the right opinion is to be outraged and horrified, and that's the end of the story.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point. And I actually think that, and I want to avoid stereotyping here, so I don't want to say men or successful people or something like that. There's very broad bell curves here, but I think that people who are aware of reality need to stand up more often and say, no, I'm aware of reality. And this comes up in so many debates in the online space, like, is watching pornography rape? I don't think young guys should sit around playing video games and watching pornography all day, but no, the answer is no. You can disapprove of something while recognizing that that's not what sex work is, recognizing that it doesn't come close to the even worse definition of something else. This has to be said in 100 different topical areas. Like, for example, the Palestinian claim is that there's a genocide in Gaza. No, there's not. A genocide is a conscious attempt to wipe out a population. And the definition has been slightly modified, yes, such that if you kill a substantial percentage of an entire population while attempting to do that, that can be genocidal. But a substantial percentage means like a third. And again, I don't mean to be glib about this, but like the Rwandan genocide is over the line. In the war in Gaza, which the Palestinians started, the two sides have been fighting for the better part of a year. You've lost perhaps 1,000 Israelis. The Gaza total after the recent adjustment, even the UN noted the Hamas figures are wildly unreliable. Many of them are just lies, like the total number of women and children. You're perhaps talking about 25,000. The population of Gaza is 2.5 million. You might correct that. The population of all of Palestine, which is Gaza plus the West Bank under Fatah, I mean, that is 6 to 7 million. A genocide is targeted against an ethnic group, not a region of land. You can argue ethnic cleansing, except the people in Gaza are all still there. They plan to rebuild after their defeat in the war. So you can say, well, this is a bloody war, but no, there is no genocide there. And I guess what I'm saying is that the reality-based community is a good label. People do need to say, okay, I'm willing to be thought an asshole. And I'm going to say, no, this just isn't real. Like, obviously, in any military conflict, there are going to be videos and picture images of death. There were far more horrifying videos and picture images of death on 7 October, actually. Rows of cars with the windows blown out and burned bodies inside them. Gang rapes, although obviously not all those were photographed. I mean, just people talking about their experiences as survivors with tears running down their face. It's not a legitimate response to you saying, well, I still think Israel has crossed the line to war crime several times, for me to post an image of a crying Israeli hostage. There has to be a core idea of reality, not pre-modern or post-modern, but modern, that we all share for conversation to even take place. And yeah, I think in the absence of that, we're seeing more empathy-driven conversations. This is something I rant about all the time online as a cynical former businessman. Like, I don't give a damn how you feel. It's not what it is. In terms of the definitions of something as important as, we mentioned sexual assault, we even mentioned genocide. This happens all the time with every concept, racism, so on. I guess the point is someone does have to be the asshole and just say, no, that's not what it means. And it's important that we understand what that means. So in terms of how consensus is established, I think that very often what you see, again, in sort of professional upper middle class circles where people do not want to be impolite, is that a small group will use emotion or empathy to establish a beachhead. You see this a lot within the professional organizations. Like I've spent a lot of time with Colin Wright and Christina Buttons looking at how the gender ideology, for want of a better word, spread. And what essentially happened is that within very large groups, like the American Medical Association at the annual conference and so on down the line, there's small panels that deal with different topics. Like every year for the Midwest and American Political Science Associations, if I'm there, I would go to the panel on methodology, improving your methods techniques, for example, just boring stats, but useful. But I mean, I assume one of those would be a panel on youth gender medicine or something like that. And I don't assume anymore. I know that a very large number of the doctors that were involved with that particular subset of medicine happened to be either transgender themselves or happened to be activists that favored a particular, at the time, fringe position on this issue. So, I mean, you essentially go into that controlled space and you say, well, this is what I think. I have this experience. You are the biggest jackass in the world if you challenge me. And I've brought some allies with me. And so pretty easily, pretty simply, you're talking about 55 doctors or something like that. You flip the requisite organization within the larger organization. The larger organization now, because of the same reasons, fear of the same techniques, is going to take the recommendation of the small interior panel. Peter Boghossian, we both know, calls this idea laundering. So you now have the ability to say, well, the American Medical Association endorses youth gender medicine. And at that point, the game is often over for 2 or 3 years. Like our side would be playing defense for some time because the argument would be, well, the American Medical Association endorsed youth gender medicine. And until you actually get the meeting notes and you look at what that meant and you actually see what the studies are that check the efficacy of these techniques, that's a hard thing to overcome. But that's very often how consensus is built. Empathic whining by specific activists that reaches the ears of organizations that then take a position that accommodates the activists, that the activists then shout out to the rest of the world. It's a hard loop to break.
Yeah, I did want to ask you one more question about hippies. Not that I'm obsessed with hippies. You've touched on this already, and I think it's a really interesting observation, which is that, well, I guess there are two things here. The first is you've already said, and I couldn't agree more, that what is presented to us as the resistance these days, or what thinks of itself as the resistance, is actually the cultural establishment, the cultural powers that be, who have a huge amount of influence politically, culturally, in terms of the media, in terms of shaping opinion, at least in certain sections of society. So it's just a false depiction of the resistance as these great rebels, when in fact they are the powers that be right now. And I was thinking about that in relation to hippies as well, because you mentioned already that a lot of what the hippies promoted has had a bad impact on society. I mean, the three things that always come to my mind in relation to the hippies is the green stuff, and their politics of environmentalism has gone down a very dodgy route in terms of anti-scientific thinking, sometimes irrational thinking or worship of nature, net zero policies, which are incredibly destructive in Europe for working class people. Also, the therapy culture. The hippies were big on therapy, and that's now given rise to new forms of authoritarian emotional policing in many ways. You know, a culture in which you have to bare your soul to the world, otherwise you'll be charged with being in denial. And then, of course, the impact they had through feminist ideas on having a rational discussion about the differences between men and women, or wanting to stand up for the values of family life. All those kinds of things were chipped away as well by some of the hippie culture that then became the culture. Would you go so far as to say that the hippies, even though they're still depicted as the great rebels of the 60s and the 70s, actually they did a great deal to forge contemporary consensus opinion, and in some cases the kind of cultural institutions we all now live under, sadly?
Yes, I would absolutely agree with that. I think you said that slightly better than I did in the book, actually. I mean, I talk about most of those points. I talk about drugs. I talk about the eco-freako movement, which includes a lot of things that are anti-human, by the way. I mean, anti-natalism. If you go back to the original Monkey Wrench gang and you read their literature, which I have over the years, I mean, it's almost a paean to small organic farming combined with hunting. It's what we spent thousands of years trying to escape. It's the idea that we should return to our isolated valleys and learn once again the spear. And by the way, that's totally incompatible with feminism and an abandonment of gender roles and so on. I mean, you'd very rapidly see like strong women with 2 babies on the hip and like strong men hunting elk if you were to do this. You'd also see the life expectancy return to 37 because the elk will fight back and there are bears in the woods and that sort of environment and so on. And I don't think too many young women after 1 or 2 experiences would actually pick them over guys. I mean, it's just, there'd be a dangerous overall setup. But so I talked about drugs. I talked about the eco stuff, talked about feminism and sex. I didn't talk about therapy. So no, I think you gave a good summary there. The reason that this became mainstream culture, though, is very important to understand. And it's that the hippies were rich kids. Like I myself, I do pretty well now, but I come from I would think it was a standard working class neighborhood. I mean, my mom was an inner city teacher. My dad, as I recall, sold wine, but my parents divorced. I mean, he wasn't in the picture. I was born on the south side of Chicago. I grew up on the east side of nearby Aurora. I mean, neighbor was a baker. People are hardworking. And I actually have a comment that I want to make about that in a second, but a movement needs a chronicler to be remembered. So the working class movements, at least in the USA, going back through probably disco, but the rave movement, everything, professional fishing, MAGA rap, just the most random things, some of which were really cool. Like there are no golden summer books in general written about them because there were no people to write them. With the hippies, that wasn't a problem. So the people that had these hip experiences that really decided that sitting around tripping on acid outside can expand your mind, which sometimes can also drive you crazy, that decided that this was an actual psychological therapy, that decided that talking to a real therapist 7 days a week was necessary, all of this different random stuff, those people didn't stay hippies. These are the people that moved into Wall Street in the 80s and became the yuppies. And that's a disconnect. My mom told me about it, but in American adult life, it's considered very rude to bring that up, actually. Like, when did you leave your scene? When did you sell out? These terms are still used pejoratively. Ravers use them. Yes, the people that were in those movements and that learned these radical ideas in the streets and so on then became the leading class in society. I mean, the former rebels are probably about half of the up middle class in at least the USA. And that leads to this extremely bizarre phenomenon where if you are debating with someone online, and I mentioned a lot of the topics that we've talked about today because they are topics of debate on Twitter, TikTok, Facebook for the older cats, so on. You see them every time you log onto a computer. If you see something in a person's profile lineup or whatever that says, blue wave, brave resistor, strong feminist, absolutely going against the mainstream, the odds that that person is an upper middle to upper class woman with an absolutely stable life are 100%. Same thing for Black Lives Matter. The odds the person's white are 80%. The odds they're financially stable are 100%. So yeah, getting to the point, hippies, the first generation of people that engaged in sort of slumming style radicalism and then took the ideas from that, often from legitimately radical friends, the Panthers and so on, and brought them into mainstream society. And I think that had a lot of damaging down road effects, from excessive therapy to polyamory becoming cool, as opposed to perhaps a casual personal taste, but not something you have to read about in the Times business section. All that is downstream from the hippie movement.
Yeah, it's funny you say that because I was going to ask you about the class question, I suppose we could call it, because that did come to mind as I was reading your book on a number of the different lies that you deconstruct. So the hippie issue, it's unquestionable that the vast majority of those hippies were, upper middle class kids, nice backgrounds. If they didn't die in a haze of drugs, they probably went on and had very good careers and made a lot of money for themselves. I also thought about it in relation to the Vietnam question. You've already mentioned that a lot of the middle-class kids didn't want to go and working-class kids were going to Vietnam. But also, you have a lie about the idea of unprovoked white flight, the idea that a load of racist whites just fled the cities in America, and that's what led to problems of racism and problems of crime and so on. And as I was reading these various lies that you pick apart, I was thinking about the role that class plays in the creation of these lies, in the creation of these consensus opinions that are very, very strongly promoted by the new establishment. Because it does seem to me that a lot of them flatter the moral and political sensibilities of the powerful classes, the people who are now in control, even though they call themselves the resistance. And they often offend the sensibilities of working people who really don't have any time for the idea that it's wonderful if their 10-year-old boy says I'm a girl, or don't have any time for the idea that, you should lie around all day smoking crack or whatever else it might be. So to what extent do you think there's a class dynamic here where these ideologies, these views, these lies in some cases are cleaved to very passionately by a certain layer of society, but they're looked upon with great skepticism by, I guess, some of the people you grew up with and the kind of people I grew up with as well?
Yeah, I mean, so the white flight chapter, just starting with kind of the practical bones of that, one of the things that has always struck me as another just sort of irrational claim, coming from, again, a working class area that was near some of them. I mean, projects are usually built on the outskirts of stable working class neighborhoods. One of the things that's always struck me as kind of bizarre is the assumption that people don't want to live in ghettos because of blind racism. First of all, in central Illinois and in Kentucky, there are a lot of white people living in the projects. That doesn't matter. You just don't want to imagine in England there are as well. That just doesn't matter. You don't want to live there. It's violent, dirty, on average. And looking at the 1960s, the storyline really seemed to be a larger extension of that. And again, this is this one era of kind of cultural revolution in American history, right? So, I mean, the typical narrative is sort of all these ethnic urban whites, Irishmen, Italians, and so on, decided to leave their ancestral neighborhoods and their old churches and so on just because they were such incoherent bigots. There was no driving force there at all. They just left and they moved to less pleasant places. That's literally almost how it's presented. And that struck me as extremely irrational. And when I started looking at the literature for this, which is one of the later chapters I decided to add to the book, what I found is that there were a bunch of forces driving American suburbanization. One of them, in fact, was that at this time, the suburbs were new built, mostly non-master planned, and quite pleasant. I mean, Lebanon dates to 1850, 1952. So prior to a certain level of personal income in society, prior to the average family having a car or two, which was very recent even here, so on, you couldn't live in the suburbs. I mean, most neighborhoods, cities would have a Pole Town, Little Italy, Bronzeville, so on down the line. And I mean, you would commute to work downtown. I mean, Detroit had the Ford plant, that sort of thing. And as it became possible to get around that and see some trees after World War II, a lot of people just did. That didn't have anything to do with race. You saw 70 or 80% as much motion out of many cities where there was almost no integration. This included some middle-class black communities in, for example, Georgia. It's included white communities in the Dakotas, Minnesota, obviously the Minneapolis area, as you saw in, for example, Chicago. So, I mean, that's one point. Just technology changed. You couldn't move to the suburbs. You had a car. But I don't want to shy away from the other point here, which is that a lot of the response to racial integration in the 1960s was not irrational. This doesn't mean whites are violent racists. It doesn't mean blacks are violent criminals. It just means that you were taking these groups that had long clashed and you were saying, well, we're going to attempt all these utopian experiments. For example, this is Boston, we're going to bus the worst white and the worst black school in the city together. This is actually a thing they did. They bust South Boston High School, you heard me, together with Roxbury High School, which is a school in the Black Hood at the time. And the results were exactly what you'd expect. I mean, there were violent brawls every day for 2 years. 40%, I believe, of the kids that had attended both schools dropped out. So busing was going on during this entire period. You also saw a massive increase in crime. So for anyone that's interested, there's a website called Disaster Center that keeps track of both the FBI and BJS crime rates in the USA. I don't know if I'd use it for a professional journal article, but it's a great quick resource. If you just go over to Disaster Center and look at the rise in crime from, say, 1963 to 1993, this period of cultural revolution that we're talking about, when you saw liberal changes to the judiciary, when you saw changes in sentencing, even when you saw some things that we're probably not going to go back on, like the introduction of Miranda rights. But this whole era of kind of criminals' rights, murder went from, I think it was 8,530 in 1963 to about 25,000 in 1993. Population didn't increase by anything like that. Forcible rape increased from 14,000, probably some underreporting there on colleges and so on, but to 106,000. Aggravated assaults, 179,000, I believe, to a bit over 1 million. These are serious, violent reported assaults, robberies, and so on. So during this time, the cities were becoming much more violent, much less pleasant. And a big reason for that was the racial tension and rioting that was following the assassinations of John F. Kennedy, Robert F. Kennedy, Martin Luther King. And all of this helped drive people out into the suburbs, which now existed. And it's sort of crazy just to deny that and to say, well, no, the actual fuel for the move was just bigotry. Bigotry did play a role, by the way, which I don't deny. But even there was sort of a weird upper class element to it that we seem to have forgotten. You had the blockbusters, for example, these legal and real estate firms that would actually come to working class neighborhoods and convince people to sell their houses. I.e., people would be saying, well, we've been in Italian, Irish, whatever neighborhood for a while. We can tolerate X percentage of African Americans as well. And someone would come to your building and say, no, you can't. Crime's going to go up. We're going to buy houses from your more terrified neighbors. We're going to ruin this neighborhood and then sell these houses at a lower price to African Americans or poor whites. This was a thing that went on for years in the 1960s, and that wasn't regulated by the government when it easily could have been. So the idea of just the individual looking around and saying, no, don't trust them, and like loading up the station wagon and moving, there's almost no basis in reality. The driving forces were the potential for suburbanization, the increase in crime, and to the extent race played a role at all, like the organized exploitation of people in both groups by the rich. So worth keeping that in mind.
Yeah, the chapter on white flight is so interesting, and it's not something I was previously familiar with. I mean, we have kind of relatively similar discussions about white flight in London because there are always movements of populations over the decades. So we have a similar discussion, but the discussion in America strikes me as really fascinating. And that chapter just breaks it. I mean, I love all the practical information you put in there. Suburbs were built by the 1950s. People had more money in the 1950s. Therefore, movements of populations were going to become more likely. So those kind of more practical explanations for what was happening, I think, is always a useful way to counter the ideological claims of the new establishment on those kinds of questions. I want to jump into line number 3, because I think some people will think it's quite a controversial one. Line number 3 that you pick apart is Native Americans were peaceful people who spent all day dancing. Now, the reason I love the title of that, apart from anything else, is because there are people who do think that. Anyone who knows anything about history will know that the Native Americans, like many other groups in society, were complicated and complex and given to acts of violence as well as acts of community and so on. But explain a little bit about why you thought it was important to challenge some of the myths that the liberal teacher puts about in relation to the Native American people.
Yeah, so there's a distinction in the book between the lies, where there's a debate in the social science, and the dishonesty is kind of teachers only teaching one side. It's probably, in all honesty, what you get with white flight. And just things that are openly untrue. Like the USA had a worse form of slavery than ancient Rome. No, we didn't. I'm enough of a male-coded geek to read about the Romans and the Mongols and so on. And if you lost a war back in the day, you were going to get a totally unwanted chance to improve your agricultural skills for the rest of your life. Like the Romans would often toss you into one of their great arenas to fight literal lions and hippopotami and so on with a stick. It had a point on it, and he gave you a short spear. But to compare this to even Confederate plantation slavery is insane. So that in that case, you're just talking about openly dishonest claims. In fact, the Roman slave laws by the end of our period of slaveholding in the USA were being rejected by courts as too harsh. Like there's a long tradition of slavery, Arab slavery. I'll never forget Barbary slavery, a trade in whites conducted almost entirely by Muslim and black masters. That, interestingly enough, has been almost totally left off the ledger because it challenges the idea of historical responsibility for slavery. So has the enslavement of Slavs, who actually gave the world the name slave. Anyway, the Native Americans chapter is an example of the second kind of lie, where if you look at the U.S. government's Native American contribution lesson, do I have a book here? No, and it kind of break rhythm to get up and get one. But it's literally, it reads like something from Pocahontas from Walt Disney. Like the seas were full of animals, the sky was full of birds, the people danced and played and hunted when they needed to. Never was any part of a prey beast wasted. I mean, it's just complete nonsense. No native tribe ever exterminated another. The reality is that the Native Americans were fascinating people, interesting animistic religion, great poets, some of the greatest warriors in history, at least when we gave them semi-modern weapons. But they weren't particularly kind-hearted or pleasant or, for that matter, good with nature. I mean, the common native technique for hunting buffalo before the introduction of the steel-tipped lance was just to drive a whole herd of them off a cliff. And when they were dying down below to cut their throats and cut the meat and hides off them and then make away. I mean, it's what you had to do to eat at that time, but I doubt, the Sierra Club would improve. But anyway, so in the Native Americans chapter, I talk about what Native societies were actually like. So I discuss Aztec cannibalism. I discuss the cool things about the Iroquois, who were kind of feminist and very well organized, but also the fact that they also sometimes ate people and they conquered perhaps a sixth of the land in the United States, what is today the United States. And I just go through all of these historical eras. I mean, many archaeologists are now arguing that the most violent period in the history of what would become the Americas occurred prior to white colonization. I mean, so you had the fall of these great, almost Aztec-level civilizations like the Anasazi in the Southwest. And that involved a great amount of death. And we're now starting to uncover those bodies. We're finding areas where hundreds of people have been killed by having their heads bashed in, been slain with axes, been slain with things that look a lot like swords that are carved out of the hardest available wood or broken out of stone. I just note this and I said, well, when the white incomers, who were also from warrior societies, Spain and Britain and so on, encountered these people, there was going to be a lot of fighting. Was that genocidal on either side? Well, occasionally, but the primary killer of Native Americans, warriors and others in the United States, we now know was disease. So about 95% of the Native Americans to die after the arrival of Europeans and other Westerners died from smallpox or one of these new plagues that were introduced to the USA. Were they introduced intentionally? Almost never. I think both sides would have been very capable of that. But you have to understand that the great books on disease transmission, like Plagues and Peoples, those go back to maybe the 1970s. Prior to that, I mean, there was some crude understanding of the germ theory of disease. I mean, it was more than that in hospitals, of course. Some soldier sitting out on the frontier didn't necessarily understand how long this bug he had was transmissible, or the idea that the equally tough people he was living among weren't immune to it because they hadn't grown up with domestic animals. I mean, that's just fantasy. It's what's called presentism. So I go through all this, the most violent era, probably not a genocide in any technical sense, so on down the line. I also make a point in this chapter, which I think is an underlying theme of the book, which is be skeptical of expertise that seems to contradict common sense. Because very often it comes from a field that's dominated by a very niche perspective. So in anthropology, if you look back over the years, one of the things they consistently try to do is describe new encounter cultures as very peaceful, to the point that it's almost funny, that it's a joke in related disciplines like political science. But I mean, a new group of people will be encountered, and anthropologists will say before they decode their language, well, we think this is a matrilineal group of herders that hardly ever fights. And what will generally occur is it will turn out to be a male-dominated group of hunters that fights wars all the time. And this has happened with people as diverse as the Bushmen and the Yanomamo. So the question might be, why does that pattern arise? Why do we keep seeing a desire for one of the rarest kinds of human society to exist? Why can't we just accept that most societies are led by men or by women that are almost equally bloodthirsty? And that gets into people's internal dialogue much more than what we see in the external world.
If you're a regular listener to this show or a regular reader of Spiked, why not become a Spiked supporter? Spiked Supporters is our thriving community of people who donate to Spiked. Anyone who gives £5 or more a month or £50 or more a year can become a Spiked supporter and get access to lots of exciting perks. Spiked supporters can comment on articles, get free and discounted tickets to events, get a discount on all items in our shop, and bookmark articles as you browse. This is our way of saying thank you to all of you who fund our work. Spiked is completely free, and yet you still hand over your hard-earned cash to make sure that anyone, anywhere can read us and listen to us. We're incredibly grateful for your generosity. If you don't give to Spiked yet, now is the perfect time to start. Just go to spiked-online.com/supporters to set up your donation and your Spiked supporters account. That's spiked-online.com/supporters. Yeah, I wanted to ask you about why. The chapter on Native Americans is really interesting, and it has some of the core points of the book as well in terms of how we should approach so-called expertise or what is presented to us as expertise. And it got me thinking about two things in particular. The first is that even though it's presented to us as an anti-racist idea to depict Native Americans as these wonderful childlike creatures in touch with nature and beautiful and loving and so on. That actually is itself quite a racist depiction, an infantilization of a people, an erasure of any of their complicating facets and cultures and traditions in order to depict them as these childlike creatures. So there's a kind of racist component to that, I've often thought. But also, in terms of why this narrative about Native Americans is promoted in schools and elsewhere, do you think part of it is that instinct to depict America prior to the arrival of the Europeans as this glorious place, and then we went and spoiled it? We ruined it. We killed all the native population, or a great number of them. We brought disease. Eventually, we brought slavery. We just are the most awful people in the world. So do you think the kind of glorification of the Native American culture is something that leads to and informs the degradation of American society?
Yes, I do. I think that's a good question. I think most of these narratives are instrumental in the sense that if you're a reasonably moral person and you feel that all your country's wealth came from slavery, you might feel that you need to compensate blacks or their white allies on the left or whatever for the horrors of slavery in the past. Now, in fact, as I understand, the UK did an analysis of the percentage of British wealth that came from slavery minus the cost of freeing the slaves and so on. It was something like 3%. It wasn't insignificant, but it was not very large. I don't think we've done something as comprehensive in the USA, but from the tallies I've looked at, you're probably talking about something like 6 to 20% of American wealth before 1865. Since 1865, the majority of Irish, Indian, Sicilian, so on, Jewish, etc., immigrants to America arrived, and our GDP's increased 11,600%. So just saying slavery built the country doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And also, what do you value each Union soldier lost in the war at? If you use the usual $10 million actuarial figure, you very probably paid any debt that was owed. But at any rate, those are all mathematical conversations to the side. The point of the argument is, of course, yes, we owe. The debt must be paid. How can black people ever forgive us? And the Native Americans extension of the argument makes this point even broader. You'll often hear people on the left say, well, the USA is founded on two horrific acts, slavery and the genocide of Native Americans. And this isn't really accurate. The United States of America is founded on the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, the successful war against England, one of the greatest powers in history. Buying land from the natives on somewhat unfair terms is something we can regret. But it did not begin the country that we won a series of wars against the fascinating but Stone Age peoples that were here when Americans arrived. That doesn't make sense. Had the natives been defeated and retained an eighth of the country as reservation land, the USA would still sweep over all of the rest of the landmass here. And you could just go on and on with these achievements, like building railroads across the country, helped define and unify the USA. Helping make humanity a spacefaring civilization. We seem to have forgotten all of this kind of thing very often in preference for this sort of self-flagellation about practices that were extremely common at the time and that actually didn't generate that much of our wealth and power. And I think it's important to keep that in mind. Yes, I think that's instrumental in most cases. I actually don't want to do the right-wing thing where everyone I disagree with is a communist and teachers are sitting around reading Karl Marx between the pages of the school textbook and, jotting down between paragraphs what they're going to lie to kids about. I don't think it's happening. But I think many people have, just as the constant feminist versus men's rights activist debate has caused people to internalize a lot of frankly unhealthy views about sexuality and the opposite sex and so on, thinking that things that the large majority of women or men, in fact, quite like normal gender roles, are bad. I think it's the same thing with this. There's kind of a dull haze of bad ideas inside a lot of people, and those have instrumental results. If you ask the average white liberal, should we pay reparations? They would probably say something, well, I'd hate to do that, but it's our duty to. After all, we took so much from black people. I don't really think that makes a lot of sense.
That's very well put. And reading your book got me thinking about whether this is something even more serious than lying, even though lying is a very serious thing to do and a problematic thing to do, but it's almost like it's the manipulation of historical truth in order to justify contemporary agendas. And so the other issue that comes to mind, and it got me thinking about this with your bonus lie number 10, which is the lie of the continuing oppression narrative, the idea that America hasn't really shaken off its past and it still is a very oppressive nation. And black people in particular have an awful time and so on, all that stuff we hear about America a lot these days. But it also got me thinking about the 1619 Project, which you've written about a lot over the years. That's the effort by various people to relocate America's founding year from 1776, the year of war and revolution and independence, to 1619, which is the year that the first slaves arrived. There's this attempt to depict America as a nation that was born in sin. It was born from, as you say, the two great sins of what it did to the Native Americans and what it did to people that it brought over from Africa. And it really does represent quite a sinister, almost Orwellian process, doesn't it, of changing the truth about the past in order to control how people think in the present. And when you think about that process taking place in schools, and as you articulate very well in the book, it is taking place in schools, you have a situation where the new generation is being misled about history in order that they will be well-behaved and correct thinking and unquestioning in the present. So it's a pretty sinister process, really, isn't it?
I mean, so this is one of those things that I'm actually pretty amoral about. I mean, I think that every society has an element of indoctrination in its educational system. Like, good boys don't do that if you're talking about brawling or the abuse of women. Good girls don't do this. You know, Americans look at the eagle and smile and so on. And I think everything that I just described is frankly pretty much healthy 85% of the time. Even when it comes to dealing with historical atrocities, I don't think that most societies dwell on those. Germany, perhaps an exception. China certainly doesn't. Nigeria doesn't. The Arabs don't. And I think there's an obvious reason for that. You assume that most other peoples had similar vices in the past, and you don't want to make people negative and cynical about your society. People who want to learn more about what history was like later on in life can go do that. In the USA, I think, and possibly Britain and Canada to a lesser extent, we've become one of the few societies in history ever to teach people a mythological narrative that makes the country look worse than it is. And I find this absolutely baffling. I mean, the explanation that I believe that comes to my mind is that we're a fairly free society. We have a lot of internal enemies, and following the instructions of people like Gramsci, Saul Alinsky, so on, a lot of these people have migrated into verticals where they can influence society. So, I mean, there's an article called The Prevalence of Marxism in Academia on Econ Live, the data resource website. And according to this piece, 18% of all university professors are Marxists, like actual identified communists. And I was curious enough when I read this that I actually looked up the percentage of people in society who are communists, and it's 0.5% of Americans identify as Marxists, which is unsurprising. I mean, America is an almost obnoxiously capitalist country. I mean, if you've seen any of the ads for like the Rezvani Vengeance SUV and this sort of thing, I mean, it's over the top a bit. I think that when you have that concentration of these people in these specific academic and media verticals, you get this crazy narrative being fed to people that obviously does some damage. I mean, I think most people to some extent shrug it off on a day-to-day basis. Oh, that doesn't matter. And we still back-to-back World War champs, this sort of thing. But if you actually ask young people, is socialism preferable to capitalism? Or is the USA a good society? Much less if you ask about allies like Britain, like Israel, you get shocking answers where very, very low percentages of people will say yes. I think it's a long-term problem for the West because many of our opponents, like the Chinese, the Arab states, perhaps the Latin Americans in the future, have memories that go back thousands of years. In these countries, people will talk to you about the Crusades and so forth. So if all of our knowledge of our society is this fantasy that's been created by left-wing activists, then we have a serious issue.
Yeah, I think that's really right. And the thing that really has shocked me in terms of some of the attitudes of the younger generation, in fact, especially the educated ones by the sounds of it, a university education now is often a marker for crazy belief rather than rational belief, which I think is a real concern. But one survey finding in both the US and the UK in recent months has been that pretty significant numbers of 18 to 25-year-olds think Israel should not exist and that the land should be handed back to Hamas, essentially. You know, get the Jews out and let the Jew haters take control. And you do start to think, what has gone wrong in education or on social media or wherever else kids hang out that they can hold on to what is essentially a genocidal belief and definitely a very, very irrational belief. I mean, it does really speak to the themes of your book, which is the question of how do these ideas get promoted and why it's so important to challenge them. That does bring me on to my last question for you, which is on the question of how we challenge them and where you see the pushback coming from. Obviously, it comes from thinkers like you, not least with this book itself. But also in America, we've seen a parental pushback against some of the stuff going on schools. There are various parents' rights movements saying, look, we don't want our kids to be taught this crap about 72 genders. We've seen similar stirrings in the UK. We've seen similar incidents in the UK where parents have said enough is enough. It's also interesting to me that the leafier the campus that one is looking at, the more likely crazy beliefs are to be running riot. Whereas if you look at a technical college, the craziness isn't as pronounced as it is on those other campuses. So there are still a lot of sensible young people out there. But in terms of the pushback against this mythology about America and this mythology about the Western world, where do you see that pushback coming from in the next few years?
So I think there are two things there. First of all, that idea that the more you know or the more you've been taught, I guess. I don't think you know anything necessarily if you have a PhD in gender studies. But the more you've been taught, the more crazy ideas you hold is something that a lot of people have been noticing. I mean, when you look at even something like the birth and fertility rate, like not people in the slums that are abusive to one another and so on, but like normal working class couples that have basic beliefs like, we should both work, him more, seem to be quite happy in marriage and to have 2.5 children and to seem to be going on as they generally have before. That's decidedly not the case for upper middle class people to go through the kind of, again, feminist v. MRA thresher. Like the ideas that you're getting seem to be bad ideas. The idea that it's submissive or unpleasant to please your partner is probably the worst thing you could bring into a relationship. And watching online and academic debates between those two blocks of people, you see that repeated just over and over and over. If that's not my duty, I'm not a simp. Even more intense equivalents from the ladies' side. That's one of the more inconsequential. I've just been debating it for a couple of days of these bad ideas. I think the primary bad ideas that are taught in the university would mostly fall along kind of the 3-point woke paradigm, which, I mean, I helped define, as I recall, for spiked. But I mean, I think there are three elements to what we call wokeness. One is the idea taken directly from Marxism that all of society that seems kind of facially neutral is set up to oppress you. So, I mean, in Marxism, if you put aside the crackpot economic theory about widgets and so on, the core idea is that what seems like a facially neutral system is in fact set up to benefit only the people at the top who own the means of production, the bourgeois. So any system, like the system for land acquisition and taxation, is in fact designed to oppress you as a member of the proletariat, the lumpen proletariat, whatever. All other critical theory is basically just a low IQ variant on this. So like critical race theory replaces the rich man with the white man. Fourth wave feminist theory replaces the rich man with the man. All of society is set up to benefit males. Marriage, was that designed by the ancient village women's councils back in the day, as many people think? No, it's a system designed to give men access to as much sex as possible and slaves in the form of children. Does that make sense? Shut up, scrote. So the same thing with queer theory. You know, it's society is set up to benefit attractive members of the sexual majority, and on down the line. The secondary element of all this is that you can tell this discrimination simply by seeing disparities. So anytime you see underperformance, i.e., at least in the direction of a minority group, i.e., blacks underperform whites on the SAT, you're seeing racism. The SAT must intentionally be designed to privilege white people over black people. And three, the solution is generally presented as being sort of empathic equity. What you do is you give everyone an equal number of shares of the job that you're competing for, or of the high level university class you're trying for, something like that, regardless of performance. And I think that kind of tripartite model is the big thing that people are getting out of the university that's taught across almost all classes. And if you believe that, you get a framework for the world that's religious in its power, but almost nonsensical. So if you see that men and women take on different roles in relationships, you're seeing oppression, especially if the women's roles are sometimes unpaid. Now, in reality, the same gender roles exist in nature because women are better at caring for children, and it's painful to do so immediately after you've been pregnant, on average. But that doesn't change the paradigm. The paradigm is a religious paradigm. Asians and Nigerians outscore whites on the SAT. It doesn't matter. They're adjacent to whiteness or something like that. So a lot of people have been hit with this kind of nonsensical theoretical framework in the universities, which began by targeting, again, the upper middle class, the upper class first. How do people fight back against this? I think one obvious element would just be to speak openly and honestly if you do not share this framework. So, I mean, I am going to continue writing. I think a lot of people are. And you're starting to see people set up institutions that are coming from the right, that are coming from the center left. I mean, in the USA, we're establishing entirely new universities, the University of Austin, this sort of thing, that have the goal of actually just teaching people practical things instead of nonsense. This is a very big point. Like, if you look at a lot of the areas that we're debating right now, like how to reduce inner city crime, we actually know how to reduce inner city crime. You just increase police stops of sketchy looking young males, and crime drops by about 90%. Bukele, the leader in El Salvador, actually took this to the logical extreme where he arrested anyone that had gang tattoos for a 2-week detention period. He declared some kind of system of national emergency, interrogated them, found out most of these people had committed crimes. There doesn't seem to have been a great deal of torture or anything involved. He found these people who looked like criminals were criminals, and he charged the people who were criminals who had committed crimes, which is most of them, with their crimes, and he sent them to prison. And homicides in El Salvador dropped from a peak of 103 per 100,000 per year to a current level of 2 per 100,000 per year. So we know how to stop crime. If you're blocked from stopping crime by this paradigm that says, well, any inequality in crime commission, for example, blacks have 2.4 times the crime rate of whites in the USA, must be caused by a deeper variable like racism. So first, we have to solve the problem of racial conflict between humans before we can address crime. You're never going to accomplish anything. So I think people that are aware of this should point this out and should work in those institutions that are looking for actual solutions. And it's not just kind of a throwaway point like, oh, we should work hard. One major advantage that kind of the center right has on this is that most people are intuitively aware that the things we're saying make sense. I think it's impossible to overestimate the importance of this. In terms of everything we've just said, do you want to please the person you're in a relationship with? Do you want to stop crime by arresting criminals? Is it possible to seal the border using walls? I think almost every sane person would say, well, yes. It seems like people have realized these things for thousands of years, and that's a huge edge. The ultimate example of this for me, probably last point, came with gender when I was on the Twitters and other social media. Like one day I actually just asked, I did a totally anonymous poll. So it was on Twitter itself, but it was linked to via SurveyMonkey. So you really couldn't tell who people were. And I asked the audience, do you believe that some women have 9-inch penises? Which is a funny but real line from Gad Saad's latest book. And obviously anyone who believes that there are trans women out there should have said, well, yes, that's not an uncommon length among men, certainly at the upper end. And I didn't know how people were going to respond because I have sort of a male, we would say, bro audience, but also everyone's feminist girlfriend and wife was on the page. I had no idea what the response would be. But the results were a 98% no. And many people just added no women have any penises, probably the majority of them, and 2% yes. And I think that's very often the case, that people are publicly saying, this is what we saw with Russian communism, which collapsed as soon as it could following the takedown of the Berlin Wall. A huge number of people are saying things they feel they have to say, that they've been told, that are kind of sneaking into their brain, manipulating how logical they are, but that they don't actually believe in. And that's a massive Schwerpunkt, a weak point to exploit.
Will, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on.